Hello, everyone. This is your Right Geek, honorary man king, and leader of the Awkward Cough Squad, sometimes, here with number one Marmaduke fan to discuss C.S. Lewis's Perelandra. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on The Right Geek, and howdy to everybody in the chat.
Howdy, howdy. All right, so we decided in the pre-show that we were going to do this chapter by chapter with Mar giving kind of his summaries and then me jumping in with key quotes as they become relevant. How does Perelandra begin? Number one
Well,
Marmaduke fan.
it starts with C.S. Lewis himself as a character being invited over to Ransom's home. And as Lewis approaches, he's sort of plagued by thoughts of doubts. He gives us a quick summary of what happened in the last book, Out of the Silent Planet. And he's aware that Ransom has encountered these ethereal spiritual beings called Eldil in deep heaven. And deep heaven is the Eldil's name for what we call space. When he finally meets with Ransom, Ransom reveals that the thoughts that were plaguing Lewis's mind are themselves the products of the bent Eldil, where bent is one of the closest words in the alien language to evil, right? So things that we talk about like sin, evil, and death to a lot of these alien life forms are foreign concepts. They essentially live in an existence without original sin. Lewis and Ransom encounter one of the Eldil. I think it's Malacandra himself, so the Lord of Mars, and the name of the planet is also the name of the Eldil. So the planet Malacandra is ruled by the Eldil, Malacandra. Prepares essentially a coffin for Ransom, which takes him into deep space and to Venus, whose real name is Perelandra. It also gives us kind of like a description of what's it like to be an Eldil or meet with an Eldil. And because they're so otherworldly, it's sort of like it's hard to put into concrete pictures, word pictures, what it's like. But one of the illustrations is they're straight, but they're so straight that even if they're at an angle to the rest of the world, looking at an Eldil makes you realize, oh, it's not them that's crooked, it's the world that's crooked in reference to them. They don't have our reference or point of view. They don't stand on the planet. They're more like lights shining through space onto our moving planet. Immediately, in the very next chapter, Ransom returns from whatever his trials or adventures is after asking Lewis to be responsible for making sure he gets out of his coffin okay, and that he might be injured when he gets back. He comes out injured, they tend to him, and it sort of sums up the conversations that Lewis, Ransom, and their friends have. So we know that whatever happens, Ransom got through this adventure okay, and there's an interesting conversation where McPhee, who we later learn is sort of a rationalist skeptic, thinks that the whole business sounds shoddy, right? Like, well, wait a second. If you're this otherworldly being, like, what are they going to do with the sexual organs, right? Are we going to have sexual organs and not use them in this otherworldly world? And Ransom's explanation is that McPhee is basically making a false dichotomy. It's not that there won't be sex in this higher spiritual world. He calls it transsexual, but in a different context than we use in sort of modern times. So when Ransom uses the word transsexual, he means there are going to be feelings or experiences above, what we call sexual. So taste there will be something like taste. That is, everything good taste is on our world, but higher and a more fulfilled kind of taste. So you don't go to heaven and sit on a cloud and eat like little cloud. You don't eat like cloud apples or anything that have no taste. You experience what taste is actually supposed to be. So the greatest tasting thing on earth is nothing compared to the most common little fruit or water in a world like Perelandra. So our setup is, well, we know that Ransom had some kind of adventure, and then the rest of the book focuses on telling us what that actual adventure is on Perelandra. So did you have anything like stand out to you in just like the first couple setup chapters?
No, my quotes start on page 61. So
Okay.
I started highlighting quotes once we get deep into his interaction with the first woman of
Right.
Perelandra. So
Right. There's also a
yeah,
pretty long section where before he meets the first woman, Ransom's kind of wandering around. He's heavily sunburned on one side, which comes up later. And he
yeah,
meets dragons and animals, and he tastes the water. And basically,
yeah.
similar to how in Out of the Silent Planet, when he gets to Mars, he almost doesn't have like a mental picture to describe what he's seeing and experiencing. So it's sort of like he has to teach himself how to see all over again for the first time on Melicandra. On Perelandra, he has all of these almost like mystical experiences with the food and the water. And he almost wonders, well, am I just supposed to be here and enjoy all this for eternity? And finally, he meets the first woman. She's bright green, and she's something like Eve. Or Aphrodite. She's
Mm-hmm.
the idea of a perfect woman is what this woman is times 10, right? And he's
Right.
never seen a woman like her in his life. It'd be like if you could see Adam and Eve before the fall in all of their glory. When he meets her, they're separated by a wave. I'm guessing it was a little hard for me to get like a picture of this, but apparently like the waves are so tall and the lands are floating. Most of the lands are floating. So that means that the lands can move apart and waves can, separate the islands from each other. When he finally meets her, she doesn't really have a framework to talk to him that much. She doesn't have a word for bad. She doesn't have a word for death. So she'll put things in her words. So if she says, "You make me grow older," piebald, right? So her way of saying, well, I've learned something is to say I've grown older. That makes it difficult for him to explain concepts to her unless he uses things she's familiar with, like the seas and the land and her yearning to find the king who she's separate from. And he learns from her that the one rule of Perelandra, the one law is she may not live on the fixed land. So in addition to the floating islands where she can live, there are fixed lands like our own continents. But God has essentially forbidden her to make a permanent residence on the fixed land. And she doesn't get why we don't have that rule on our world, but this rule is going to be like the central plot point. So Ransom has to reference this rule to kind of like explain things to her about our world and about sin and death. And finally, Weston, the villain of the first book, arrives and starts to play a role similar to Satan in the Genesis story, where he's trying to persuade her with all of his powers of persuasion to make a residence on the fixed land. It reminds me a lot of Marcion, like the first century, maybe first or second century Christian heretic, who he had the bright idea that maybe the serpent in the story of Genesis is the good guy, and God really wanted to offer the knowledge of good and evil to Adam and Eve. So God really wanted Adam and Eve to disobey the bad creator God. Now, what's different though is whereas the Genesis story is very short, the debate, the debate or dialogue between Ransom and Weston just goes on for whole chapters as they get into whether or not the woman should disobey God. And it's essentially like a long, very well thought out dialogue on kind of like the human condition and why might it have been a good idea for Adam and Eve to disobey God, with Ransom desperately trying to persuade her that if you do this thing, death's going to enter into this world and it's going to become marred. All of this beauty, all of this wonder is going to be lost somehow.
Right.
So you started taking notes about when Weston enters the picture?
So basically what... actually, my first note happened when Ransom is trying to explain to her the idea of disappointment. The idea of encountering something you didn't expect or you didn't want and being disappointed with it, which she doesn't understand. And it says, after he tries to explain it to her, she says, "What you have made me see," answered the lady, "is as plain as the sky, but I never saw it before. Yet it has happened every day. One goes into the forest to pick food, and already the thought of one fruit rather than another has grown up in one's mind. Then, it may be, one finds a different fruit, and not the fruit one thought of. One joy was expected, and another is given. But this I had never noticed before, that at the very moment of the finding, there is in the mind a kind of thrusting back, or a setting aside. The picture of the fruit you have not found is still, for a moment, before you. And if you wished, if it were possible to wish, you could keep it there. You could send your soul after the good you had expected, instead of turning it to the good you had got. You could refuse the real good. You could make the real fruit taste insipid by thinking of the other. So I believe I highlighted this because I thought that was an interesting sort of reflection or discussion on the fact that in our bent world, that people's expectations or desires or wants often distracts them from being able to see what is good in their own lives, and it distracts them from being able to feel and express gratitude for the things that they do have.
Yep. A couple neat things about that section you just read is later Weston uses that exact same illustration against Ransom. So Ransom's just genuinely trying to teach her about God and about the world, using explanations that make sense to her. Weston is such a good manipulator. Right. He knows how to take Ransom's illustrations, turn them on their head, and make the opposite point of what Ransom was trying to make. Also, maybe a neat thing about the queen or the woman is that she's not stupid and she's not like a child. She doesn't have a frame of reference for human experience on Earth. So the challenge is how to explain something to somebody who doesn't have a frame of reference for it. And Ransom has to work to find something close to a frame of reference for her. And because she's intelligent, she's actually able to understand the point, even though she's never experienced something exactly like human disappointment in the fallen world. The closest is wanting a fruit and not finding the fruit you were looking for is the closest simple mental picture to disappointment. Ransom kind of makes the point that the bent one is someone who was so in love with an old idea of good, kind of like in the pre-creation, that he rebelled against God in order to establish his idea of the good and reject God's idea of the good. So that and again, it's fruit, right? So one kind of neat thing about Perelandra is throughout it, there's a really strong parallel between the Perelandra story and the Genesis story. But at several points, we're forced to think more deeply about this situation than the Genesis story could, because the Genesis story is very brief in its scope. And we're kind of like forced to realize, well, maybe this isn't the Genesis story. Maybe things will play out differently in this world. Maybe the situation isn't exactly the same. So again, Lewis is very, very good at setting up plot points that he'll develop later in just the simple little conversation they have when they first meet. When Weston appears, another neat thing is we've seen this character before, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say there was one more thing I marked in that section a couple pages later. This is describing Ransom's feeling of God's presence. So I have the effects of resistance versus obedience in God. I actually put a note on this. So this is Ransom thinking, but later on he discovered that it was intolerable only at certain moments. At just those moments, in fact, symbolized by his impulse to smoke and to put his hands in his pockets, when a man asserts his independence and feels that now at last he's on his own. When you feel like that, then the very air seemed too crowded to breathe. A complete fullness seemed to be excluding you from a place which, nevertheless, you were unable to leave. But when you gave in to the thing, gave yourself up to it, there was no burden to be borne. It became not a load, but a medium, a sort of splendor, as of eatable, drinkable, breathable gold, which fed and carried you, and not only poured into you, but out from you as well. Taken the wrong way, it suffocated. Taken the right way, it made terrestrial life seem, by comparison, a vacuum. So I noted here, this is the effects of resistance versus obedience to God. resistance of God versus obedience to God. This is basically saying when you resist God's presence in your life, that's when you feel that God is something that is suffocating and oppressing you.
Yeah.
When you give into it, when you obey it, that's when you feel that it is correct, right?
Yep.
That's when it feels genuinely full in a way that doesn't oppress. Yeah.
Another way of looking at it is, I think Lewis is fascinated by the idea of a thing that can be seen or experienced in two different ways. So, and like the mental picture is, you know, you get home, you put your hands in your pockets and you smoke a cigarette and you're alone, right? So again, like kind of like this theme of, you know, oh, I just want to get away from everybody. I just want to get off by myself and just shut all that out. In that moment, you could either feel stifled or you could feel free. God could be like a stifling experience. Oh, he's lording it over me and I don't have any space to myself. Or the experience of God could be this really blissful sense of peace. It's the same, two people experiencing the same thing, but with 180-degree different view of what they're experiencing, which later in the debate is going to be a big point where they're both trying to describe the same thing. Should you or should you not disobey God? And their descriptions of it are 180 degrees opposed to each other, where disobeying God could be described as this glorious revolution to assert ourselves, or disobeying God could be disobeying God, going against the good.
Right. Yeah. So then after that, then we start. All of my notes are now after Weston's appearance. So yeah. So yes, we have this great debate on whether or not we should disobey God. And my first note here is Weston talking about how great men should be what's the word I'm looking for? They should be exempt from the standard rules of morality, essentially.
And this is before he's possessed, right? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So he says, "My dear Ransom, I wish you would not keep relapsing on to the popular level. The two things are only moments in the single unique reality. The world leaps forward through great men, and greatness always transcends mere moralism. When the leap has been made, our diabolism, as you would call it, becomes the morality of the next stage. But while we are making it, we are called criminals, heretics, blasphemers." "How far does it go?" asked Ransom. "Would you still obey the life force if you found it prompted you to murder me?" "Yes." "Or to sell England to the Germans?" "Yes." "Or to print lies as serious research in a scientific periodical?" "Yes." "God help you," said Ransom. So this is before the possession, and this is basically Weston arguing that, as I said, it's Weston arguing that men who are great, and are meant to advance humanity, should be left, as I said, exempt from conventional morality, right?
Yeah.
That they should be allowed to do anything, right? Basically anything in order to achieve their aims.
The will to power. Yeah.
The will to power. Yeah. This is basically, yes, him representing in a narrative text what the will to power looks like. Yeah.
Something I want to highlight about Weston is he can never do anything by halves. So in the first book, he's obsessed with preserving the human race, even if he has to exterminate all the other life forms to make space for the human race, right? Yeah. So at the end of it, he gets humiliated, and he seemingly learns from that experience and has to admit that he was too narrow-minded. Something he was forced to experience something which made him say, "Okay, well, I'm a scientist. I've got to rethink my view of the universe." And he comes to something like a spiritual or religious understanding of the universe, which he describes in purely scientific language. That he starts seeing God as the end towards which life is thrusting, and he sees Satan as a force that pushes us forward towards that force. So what's interesting about the debate is that Ransom can see that they're saying two very different things. Weston thinks Ransom's narrow-minded and thinks they're actually saying the same thing. Oh, we both believe in God and the devil. We just mean different things by that. And I'm not held back by narrow Christian or orthodoxy in my scientific view of the supernatural. So Weston has concluded that what Christians call God and Satan are the same thing, kind of tying into maybe like an ancient Greek debate. Is everything one or is everything many? Are we all going to be united into like one consciousness after death, or is everything kind of like its own individual atom or universe, right? And in kind of like our modern times, it's a little similar to the problem of orthodoxy and anarchy, where if you just have like, oh, well, I've got like the one correct ideological system that, it's the theory of everything, it'll predict everything, that can become like this monstrous institutional power, right? So that's something like, well, Ransom would say, well, the Christian church is one of those kinds of things. They actually think they have the truth. And on the other side, you would have relativism, where everybody's can just believe whatever they want. Everybody has their own personal truth, which means more freedom, but it also means no unity, no ability for us to even communicate or understand one another. Weston, although he was ironically a naturalist materialist, has pushed himself kind of like through the force of his intellect back to square one. He's back to believing there is a oneness to the universe, and that there's a religious mystical force to the universe, but he refuses to accept the idea that could be God. And so as was foreshadowed in the last book, where he said, I actually identify with this bent one. He says, I invite this force into myself, and has a seizure, which we'll later learn is Weston begins to be the instrument through which the bent one acts to try to corrupt Perelandra and corrupt the woman.
Right. And my next quote, I believe, I think fits in with that, the descent of the demonic, or the appearance of the demonic in Weston, the thing that possesses him, right? I have this quote right here. The children, the poets, and the philosophers were right. As there is one face above all worlds, merely to see which is irrevocable joy, so at the bottom of all worlds, that face is waiting, whose sight alone is the misery, from which none who beholds it can recover. And though there seemed to be, and indeed were, 1,000 roads by which a man could walk through the world, there was not a single one which did not lead sooner or later to either the beatific or the miserific vision. He himself had, of course, seen only a mask or faint adumbration of it. Even so, he was not quite sure that he would live. So we have the contact with the demonic, and it has kind of a parallel in biblical contacts with angels and the angelic, right? Or with God himself, the fact that if you were to look upon God's face, you would die, that sort of thing. So
they both unmake you, but for different purposes.
Yeah.
A devil unmakes you to consume you and use you for its own purposes. The angelic almost unmake you because they're too glorious for you. It's like you fall apart just about. Alas, I am undone. It's too good. It's too beautiful. I can't handle it.
It's too good. Yeah, exactly. So I had that one, and then we get to you mentioned before that during the debate there's you mentioned that Weston is presenting the case that disobeying God is actually a good thing, right? That it led to good, right? So this was the response to that particular case, the fact that even the church says, "Oh happy sin of Adam," right? Yeah. So does that mean that was actually a good thing? So the response here is, of course, good came of it. Is Maladil a beast that we can stop his path, or a leaf that we can twist his shape? Whatever you do, he will make good of it, but not the good he had prepared for you if you had obeyed him. That is lost forever. The first king and first mother of our world did the forbidden thing, and he brought good of it in the end. But what they did was not good, and what they lost, we haven't seen. So it's like, so basically him saying that, just because we now have Christ and we have this wonderful thing that came from the sin of Adam, that doesn't mean that the counterfactual of Adam not sinning would not have resulted in something equally as wonderful and miraculous, right?
And with less of the pain and marring. Yeah, many people died for no greater purpose, or in an ugly fashion. Like, a lot of people have lived short, ugly, brutish lives, to paraphrase like the famous quote about the Middle Ages, right? Because of the fallenness of the world. Again, in that back and forth, one of the things is that when Ransom describes death, the woman interprets that as, oh, so your soul goes to be with Maleldil, so that's good. But then Ransom has to explain, no, death is a tragic thing. We hate it. It has a foul smell. Later, Weston, the unman, argues that, well, I've come to bring you death in abundance. Isn't death a good thing if you get to be with Maleldil? So a lot of the back and forth is playing on the fact that because the woman hasn't experienced this, she doesn't have enough knowledge of good and evil to know the full implications of what her choice will be, apart from the two going back and forth about whether it's a good idea or bad idea. It always comes back down to whether or not she will disobey Maleldil in the final decision. Everything the unman does is to try to almost construct. He has to give her an idea of poetry. He has to give her an idea of beauty and admiring yourself in a mirror. He has to give her an idea of narrative and tell her stories about strong women standing up against the stupid and incompetent Homer Simpson men, right? He has to almost create a sense of narrative within her to make her accept the idea that, well, maybe if I disobey Maleldil, it'll be part of a great story and I'll be a heroine and I'll make this sacrifice. I think at one point Lewis describes it as a third-degree sales tactic.
Yeah, right. And yeah, I did bookmark that part too, where it describes Weston telling the stories of heroic women who were witches and perverts, but they were only perceived that way because they were great, right?
And Lady Macbeth, right? So Lady Macbeth, no one who reads Lady Macbeth thinks Lady Macbeth is good. He's presenting the story of Lady Macbeth out of context and relying on the fact that the woman can't interpret the story of Lady Macbeth, hoping it'll just inspire her, right? Yeah, it's an ugly thing. Maybe one more theme is, in Perelandra, we start seeing a lot the idea that Satan isn't this dashing romantic, fellow with a handsome mustache and a rapier. He's really kind of just like an ugly and childish guy who's just smart enough to be a good manipulator.
Yes, and that's my next quote. Yeah, that's my next quote, actually. So we get to the point where the unman is basically sitting there taunting Ransom by saying his name over and over again. Ransom, 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 Ransom.
What?
And at one
Nothing.
point, what? What do you want? Yeah. But then eventually he's like, and then nothing. Yeah. What do you want? Nothing. And so eventually he stops answering him and just sits there listening to the demon saying, Ransom, 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 right? But he's thinking in his head. What chilled and almost cowed him was the union of malice with something nearly childish. For temptation, for blasphemy, for a whole battery of horrors, he was in some sort prepared. But hardly for this petty, indefatigable nagging, as of a nasty little boy at a preparatory school. Indeed, no imagined horror could have surpassed the sense which grew within him as the slow hours passed, that this creature was, by all human standards, inside out. Its heart on the surface and its shallowness at the heart. On the surface, great designs and an antagonism to heaven, which involved the fate of worlds. But deep within, when every veil had been pierced, was there, after all, nothing but a black puerility, an aimless, empty spitefulness, content to sate itself with the tiniest cruelties, as love does not disdain the smallest kindness. Exactly. So what we have here is we have him dispelling. We have C.S. Lewis dispelling the idea that Satan and evil is something romantic and dashing, that it is in fact petty and spiteful and childish and empty, and ultimately empty inside. Which goes into what I have always been taught in my tradition, that that Satan cannot create anything. He can only corrupt what's already been created by God. That So Satan has no power, right? He can only there's nothing creative or wonderful about him. He just destroys what's already here, which I think in our current culture we have some contact with Satan's work, the idea that in the people who wish to destroy and deconstruct instead of building. Seems like Satan is very active.
They invade the good stories that are already there and corrupt them from within. Maybe like an interesting contrast where Perelandra doesn't fit with the Genesis story is the unman tortures and murders animals for fun, which means that death can exist in this world without the fall having occurred. So maybe there's this first little hint that things aren't working out 100% like they work out in Genesis.
Well, that's
go ahead.
There's a suggestion, first of all, that the incarnation has changed everything, right? Mm-hmm. That the Hanan that lived on the Now that lived on Malacandra, they came in many different forms, right?
Yeah.
But then after the incarnation, we all look like man now, right? Mm-hmm. That could be a situation like that. Difference might suggest that the fall of Earth might have had some kind of ripple effect impact on the universe as well.
The other interesting thing is the woman's resistance. So later, Ransom will actually wonder, well, it doesn't say anything about whether Eve did resist at all, and how long could Eve have resisted? Would the serpent have just gone on tempting Eve forever? So something that strikes him is that when he seems to win a debate with the unman, it just is incredibly persistent. It comes back the next day and the next day and the next day and tries different angles, tries to teach her different things. So the fact that it uses Ransom's arguments against it puts her in the situation where she's not quite sure who she can trust. And sometimes the unman makes a mistake. So he'll try to teach her something like the word create, and that'll upset his intentions, because if she can put two and two together and say, oh, he's trying to get me to be my own little Oyarsa, right? Then she'll see through it. But because he keeps coming back, even if there's a moment where she sees through it, or it says, no, I'm not going to disobey Malildil, then he'll abandon that and try something else. It's gaslighting. It's, if you need a good definition for gaslighting, basically the entire unman's pitch is gaslighting extended out as long as he can possibly do it. Yeah.
And it's taking things again and warping them for his own ends. So as you said before, you use something like Lady Macbeth, but you don't tell the actual story of Lady Macbeth. You tell the warp story, right?
Mm-hmm. And he uses repetition too. So if she doesn't like one, he'll just do another one. It almost kind of like connects to like the problem of TV and the internet. Like for a malicious person, you can just pump out as much propaganda as possible. And who cares if someone sees through one piece of propaganda if you've got 10 million pieces of propaganda?
Right. I also have here a section in which Ransom starts to... so this is the part where he says, the enemy was using third-degree methods. It seemed to Ransom that, but for a miracle, the lady's resistance was bound to be worn away in the end. Why did no miracle come? Or rather, why no miracle on the right side? For the presence of the enemy was in itself a kind of miracle. Had hell a prerogative to work wonders? Why did heaven work none? Not for the first time, he found himself questioning divine justice. He could not understand why Malildil should remain absent when the enemy was there in person. But while he was thinking this, as suddenly and sharply as if the solid darkness about him had spoken with their articulate voice, he knew that Malildil was not absent. that sense, so very welcome, yet never welcomed without the overcoming of a certain resistance, that sense of the presence, which he had once or twice before experienced on Perelandra, returned to him. The darkness was packed quite full. It seemed to press upon his trunk so that he could hardly use his lungs. It seemed to close in on his skull like a crown of intolerable weight, so that for a space he could hardly think. Moreover, he became aware in some indefinable fashion that had never been absent, that only some unconscious activity of his own had succeeded in ignoring it for the past few days.
He's experiencing that same. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's experiencing that same oppressive feeling, right? Because he's resisting the presence, right? Yeah. And
because he's part of the fallen world, the unmanned techniques haven't just been working on the woman; they've been working on Ransom, who's supposed to be opposing him. Yeah.
Right. So he's supposed to be opposing him, but he's in this moment of doubt. Like, where is God? And it's a very human, very relatable question for a character to ask. Where the evil seems to be winning the day. Where is God? Right. But then he comes to the realization on the next page, and then he wondered how it had escaped. And then he wondered how it had escaped him until now. He was forced to perceive that his own coming to Perelandra was at least as much of a marvel as the enemy's. That miracle on the right side, which he had demanded, had in fact occurred. He himself was the miracle. So it's almost like so he's asking, where is God? Where is God? And then he realizes that, oh, God put me here. That this is my responsibility. This is my agency, right? That he's expecting God to swoop in a flash of light, right? Without realizing that God works his ways oftentimes through people, right?
Meldil wants me to do this. If I don't do it, it doesn't get done. Yeah. There's a really nuanced idea of the self in this. It's almost like C.S. Lewis is anticipating, well, I'm sure he's familiar with the postmodernist, right? So he's sort of anticipating a postmodern problem and prescribing a solution that's better to a lot of, like normie conservatives' solution to the problem. So Ransom is arguing with himself. I think that Lewis uses the phrase the voluble self to describe it. So you have to almost imagine that in Ransom's mind, there's a little picture of Ransom, and Ransom is arguing with the picture of Ransom. I think Lewis is simultaneously saying that that picture of yourself isn't yourself. And it's possible that picture could be giving you really bad arguments, right? So on the one hand, you have to be suspicious of this picture of yourself. On the other hand, when you overcome the resistance, you gain a sense of self that's greater than just ego. Or maybe in like postmodernism, they would say, well, the self is just a social construct. You're a slave of the machine of society, right? So Lewis is actually identifying a flaw in the conception of the self, where a lot of conservatives have a very strong individualistic conception of the self. And he's saying, well, it's not good to have an individualistic conception of the self that makes you fight against God, essentially. And on the other hand, there's maybe like a nothing. There's an unman that has no self. It's just a pure, banal selfishness. And he's finding kind of like under God, you have a sense of the self that is healthy and at peace, because it's no longer you arguing with this stupid version of yourself. It's you knowing what you have to do.
And it's interesting to me, again, as someone with a background in neuroscience, this concept of the voluble self, because they have found in the sort of rough division of the two hemispheres of the brain, right, that and this is not like, it's not a simplified picture of the right brain only does this and the left brain only does that. Both sides do a lot of everything, but there seems to be a certain specialization in which the right brain seems to be more attuned to like the gestalt or the world as a whole and your place in it. Whereas the left hand side of the brain is looking at details and deconstructing things and putting them back together, right? And the left brain for most people is also the speaking brain, the voluble brain, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things they found when they do like split brain research, where they have like patients that don't have the connection between the right and the left halves, because they've had like surgery for epilepsy or something like that, so they split the brain in half to stop the seizures from propagating, right? What they found is that the left brain has, and they've done work with stroke victims too. When they have right brain stroke, like weird things happen to their perceptions of themselves when something hits the right brain. Like they will stop perceiving of the left half of their body as even being real or a part of them. So the left brain it's the tool using speaking part of the brain, so it's useful in that way. But it does have a very strange picture of yourself. So just like in the last stream, I said it's interesting that that C.S. Lewis seems to be anticipating what we actually find in terms of sensation and perception. That there has to be a brain that has learned how to see before you can see anything, right? Mm-hmm. Here he seems to be anticipating or perceiving the idea that there's a division in our brain between the rationalizing voluble self and the rest of the brain that knows what the actual reality is, right? So, right. Yeah.
I want to mention a couple of Ransom's rationalizations before we move on. So, like, one of the things he tells himself is, well, maybe I'm just here to witness this and go back to Earth and tell the story of how Perelandra fell. Maybe if I run away, God will forgive me for that. Or maybe I'm just supposed to try my best. Oh, there's also like a really strong, Lewis is very fascinated in masculinity and femininity. And
oh yeah, I have a quote on that.
Right.
I have a quote on that. Yeah.
I think he develops it more in hideous strength. But I just want to point out that one of the things that comes to Ransom's mind is his mother telling him, just do your best, fulfilling kind of like a beautiful maternal role for him.
Evie, I studied it in college for my undergrad. I'm now a teacher. I teach math and science for a living. But that's how I learned about all that brain stuff.
And the corpus callosum experiment, there's like a nice just YouTube video where they interview the guy, and he describes for himself like what his experience is when, you know, looking at something purely through the left eye or purely through the right eye. And I think the experiment was they had to split his corpus callosum as a way of treating his seizures. So that gave them an opportunity to basically find out, well, what do you see if only one side of your brain is aware of a certain piece of information, right? So I'm probably oversimplifying it, but yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, if there's a stroke on the right hand side of the brain, and that's obviously going to affect the left hand side of the body because the opposite sides of the brain control the opposite sides of the body. They will ask people who have had major strokes on the right side about their left arm, which they can't use, and they'll refuse to believe that left arm is actually their arm. But that never happens. That doesn't happen when you have a stroke on the left side.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between it's so weird. It's weird to study the cases of people who have had weird things happen in their brain, especially on the right hand side of the brain, because it's the bizarre distortions of reality that occur are just really fascinating. But going back to Perelandra after we veered off on that tangent. Yeah. So you were talking about Ransom's rationalizations, why he couldn't possibly be here to actually be the instrument of God to save Perelandra from the fall, right? I have a quote here on page 138. The voluble self that you mentioned protested wildly, swiftly, like the propeller of a ship racing when it is out of the water. The The imprudence, the unfairness, the absurdity of it. Did Maladale want to lose worlds? What was the sense of so arranging things that anything really important should finally and absolutely depend on such a man of straw as himself? And at that moment, far away on earth, as he now could not help remembering, men were at war, and white-faced subalterns and freckled corporals who had but lately begun to shave stood in horrible gaps or crawled forward in deadly darkness, awaking, like him, to the preposterous truth that all really depended on their actions. And far away in time, Horatius stood on the bridge, and Constantine settled in his mind whether he would or would not embrace a new religion. And Eve herself stood looking upon the forbidden fruit, and the heaven of heavens waited for her decision. He writhed and ground his teeth, but could not help seeing. Thus, and not otherwise, the world was made. Either something or nothing must depend on individual choices. But the reaction of how could it possibly depend on something as small and insignificant as me, right? Is something that that is again reflecting biblical narratives, right? Like Moses, for example, saying, you know, no, I can't possibly be the instrument of God. I have a speech impediment, right? You know, that's ridiculous, right? But that's something that God does. Is take the silly and stupid and insignificant and make them into great instruments of his love, right? Even the apostles, if you read when you read the Gospels and you read how the apostles behave, you're like, man, they're really silly, stupid people.
Yeah.
And
he actually thought he thought of Peter specifically while he was arguing with the voluble self. Peter denied Christ. Right. Why can't I leave this planet behind?
Right. Peter being the prime example. He's a little bit slow. Peter is. Yeah. He's someone who doesn't wait for the boat to be rowed to shore. He has to jump in the water right away because Christ is on the shore, right? Yeah. You know, he's not the sharpest chopstick in the drawer. Let's just say that. But they made him. You know, they made him great. In my tradition, they made him the first pope, right? So, that's what God does, right? But in the Bible, the people who are meant to be, those instruments of God's power, right, often resist and say, how can it possibly be me? I have this flaw, I have that flaw, I have this flaw. They're always picturing someone who is, Captain America or something, somebody perfect that can, doesn't have any flaws at all, right? So
more close to the image of God or the ideal image of the hero. Maybe one last thing, I call it like Ransom's Garden of Gethsemane scene, because once he realizes I have to do something, then the other obvious problem is the unman is terrifying, and I'm scared of it, like I'm scared of monsters when I was a little kid, right? And he has a very vivid imagination of being ripped apart, of it being painful, and of having to face essentially like a bogeyman, like when you were like 6 and you hid under the covers and you were afraid something was going to come out of the shadows and get you. That's what he's got to overcome. And I think the moment that clicks for him is, well, what if I just go beat him up, right? And he has to argue with himself about it at first, because at first it's like that's too easy, right? I can't possibly be meant to go punch Satan in the face. The reason I thought of this is his very first conversation with Lewis is, well, Lewis, you think that the battle with the powers and authorities is purely a spiritual and moral battle, and it was that, but why shouldn't it also be a physical battle? So Ransom knew this going into Perelandra, and now Ransom is forced to confront something that before he was just thinking about. I'm going to Perelandra to oppose Satan, and then once he gets there, it's almost like, wait a second, it can't be that easy. And one of his illustrations is, surely you can't be telling me that if an elephant trampled on the serpent that before Eve ate the fruit, that humanity would be saved, right? And the voluble self has to argue, well, maybe you're being arrogant. Maybe you just arrogantly assume you can beat up Satan and punch him in the face, and that's just your pride talking, right? So what's kind of beautiful about it is once the idea occurs to him, then it's like everything clicks into place for him, because he knew this can't go on. He's using third degree tactics. She's resisted
Yeah.
thus far, but she can't resist forever.
Right.
And that one seemingly stupid idea is what he,
Yeah.
he realizes, oh, that's what I've got to do. And then we get like the really cool,
Yeah.
the fight scene between Ransom and the Unman would make a great Shonen Jump battle manga sequence. It's got everything. It's got like 2 different fighting styles, multiple stages, a lot of symbolism in the fighting style. It's great stuff.
Yeah. And you're like down in the mountain and all that. Yeah.
Maybe one thing I noticed about the fighting style is that Ransom fights by boxing and the Unman fights by grappling and scratching, right? So there's something inhuman and bestial about the Unman's fighting style. It's all about bleeding his opponent and sort of sapping his strength. And Ransom's is the bit more of a manly, direct approach. I even like the mental picture of Satan getting punched in the face really hard so he loses a tooth.
Yeah.
It's a very British fighting style for Ransom.
Yeah. And ultimately what happens after he battles the Unman is he incurs a permanent injury of his heel. And I think the choice of the body part there is very deliberate.
Yeah, it's to remind people who may not be familiar, but in Genesis, God tells Adam and Eve that there will be a descendant from the woman. The serpent shall strike his heel, but he shall crush the serpent's head. So it's one of the very first foreshadowings of the coming of Christ for the very first man and woman.
Yeah.
So Ransom isn't
in my
literally
church,
Christ,
we call
but
that
Ransom is becoming like he's becoming Christ-like in many respects. Yeah.
Christ-like. Yeah. In my church, we call that the proto-evangelion, the first message of Christ. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he has this. Evie says, "So Ransom versus the Unman in the Record of Ragnarok manga style." Yes, I actually want to see that now.
Did you take any notes on when Weston apparently wakes up and comes to himself and talks to Ransom again? Because I think that's where it gets into sort of like Weston's view of hell comes across there. Mm-hmm. And I feel like some of that's important because it's sort of foreshadowing a bit some stuff in it's foreshadowing the hideous strength a bit. And maybe it's like Lewis getting back into his cosmology. So if Lewis's view of heaven isn't that you go out into an empty void, but you go up into deeper and deeper heaven, then Weston experiences something like hell, where he starts imagining the world as a rind. And all we're trying to do is desperately keep from sinking into the rind and falling deeper and deeper into the center of the earth, or from physically falling into hell. Weston's clearly experienced something like this that's horrified him.
I'm see if I've.
It's interesting because it's sort of like Weston is a little bit like H.P. Lovecraft, where H.P. Lovecraft has this idea that, oh, there are these gods, but they exist to torture us and to drive us mad, right? So Weston's experienced the divine, and he's been horrified by what he thinks his fate will be. And he just doesn't believe Ransom when Ransom tells him that there's a glorious thing above, not just the dark thing below. And the rind comes up later. The woman will talk about the rind later after the business is finished with the Unman.
I have a note about him. What was before him appeared no longer a creature of corrupted will. It was corruption itself, to which will was attached only as an instrument. I have that one, the description of the Unman. I'm trying to click through here. Trying to find. Yeah, I know which part you're talking about.
Ransom tells him something like, be a man, say a children's prayer if you can't say a man's, right? He has to basically like encourage Weston to get a hold of yourself, and let's just try to get get out of this, as Weston's basically ready to lay down and die, or just he's so desperately he doesn't want to die, he's just desperately afraid of death.
Yeah, so I think I found it. I think I found it now. So these thoughts must have taken several hours and absorbed all his attention. He was aroused by what he least expected, the sound of a human voice. Emerging from his reverie, he saw that all the fishes had deserted him. His own was swimming feebly, and there a few yards away, no longer fleeing him, but moving slowly towards him, was the unman. It sat hugging itself, its eyes almost shut up with bruises, its flesh the color of liver, its leg apparently broken, its mouth twisted with pain. Ransom, it said feebly. Ransom held his tongue. He was not going to encourage it to start that game again. Ransom, it said again in a broken voice, for God's sake, speak to me. He glanced at it in surprise. Tears were on his cheeks. Ransom, don't cold shoulder me, it said. Tell me what has happened. What have they done to us? You're all bleeding. My leg's broken. Its voice died away in a whimper. Who are you? He asked sharply. Oh, don't pretend you don't know me, mumbled Weston's voice. I'm Weston. You're Ransom. Owen Ransom of Leicester, Cambridge, the philologist. We've had our quarrels, I know. I'm sorry. I dare say I've been in the wrong, Ransom. You'll not leave me to die in this horrible place, will you? Where did you learn Aramaic? Asked Ransom, keeping his eyes on the other. Aramaic? Said Weston's voice. I don't know what you're talking about. It's not much of a game to make fun of a dying man. But are you really Weston? Said Ransom, for he began to think that Weston had actually come back. Who else should I be? Yeah, so you're talking about this part then. Yep. Yeah.
Either the unman gives Weston, lets go of Weston for a little bit and gives him like one last chance to talk to Ransom, or the unman is so clever that maybe Weston's dead and gone, and the unman just knows how to imitate Weston, which it's implied that the unman has to manipulate Weston's body, and it's a little unsettling because it's like someone who's very good at imitating human movement is doing it, but there's something about it that's just not quite right. The spark of, you can tell that the spark of life isn't there, even if the movements are technically correct. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're talking about this part in particular. Children are afraid to go through a churchyard at night, and the grown-ups tell them not to be silly, but the children know better than the grown-ups. People in Central Africa doing beastly things with masks on in the middle of the night, and missionaries and civil servants say it's all superstition. While the blacks know more about the universe than the white people. Dirty priests and back streets in Dublin frightening half-witted children to death with stories about it. You'd say they are unenlightened. They're not, except that they think there's a way of escape. There isn't. That is the real universe, always has been, always will be. That's what it all means. I'm not quite clear, began Ransom when Weston interrupted him. That's why it's so important to live as long as you can. All the good things are now. A thin little rind of what we call life, put on for show, and then the real universe forever and ever. To thicken the rind by 1 centimeter, to live 1 week, 1 day, 1 half hour longer, that's the only thing that matters. Yeah, so, right, so we have him waking up and possibly being the real Weston, and him basically saying that what he's basically saying here is that death is all there is, right? That after death, that's the real universe, and we should be afraid of it, right? We should be afraid of death.
He circled back to the Greeks' idea of death, where everybody just goes to Hades and gets a really poetic punishment for all eternity.
Right. And that is why you must cling to life, every extra hour and second of life that you can, because after life, there is only the terrible horror of death, right?
Yeah.
So,
I recall he tries to drag Ransom down. Ransom essentially has to like strangulate him to keep him from drowning him. And later, as Ransom is walking through this pitch black cave, and again, it kind of like has some time to think to himself in absolute blackness, he sees a red light, and the unman follows him again. This time, it's definitely the unman animating Weston's dead body. So there's this neat parallel where Weston's afraid of death and just wants to live as long as he can. maybe that's the unman talking, and then the unman literally animates bodies supernaturally, right? So
Right.
maybe both the unman
That's
and the intellectual human servant of the unman are really afraid of the same thing, like children who are scared of the dark. They're afraid of hell, and the intellectual can justify that any way they want, but the fear of hell and the fear of death continues to motivate them in ways that most people are unaware of, and that Weston, when he's finally willing to admit how terrified he is of it, it's basically when he's at like his last thread of life before he goes towards it.
Yeah. Homer knew that all the dead. So here's what you were saying about the Greeks.
Yeah.
Homer knew that all the dead have sunk down into the inner darkness under the Rhine, all witless, all twittering, all gibbering, decaying boogeymen. Every savage knows that all ghosts hate the living who are still enjoying the Rhine, just as old women hate girls who still have their good looks. It's quite right to be afraid of the ghosts. You're going to be one all the same. Yeah. So, right. So he's discovered that that death is real and hell is real. Right. So he circled back to that, but never gets to what the good news is. Basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also a neat sequence where Ransom, when he encounters the unman, he thinks he sees some sort of insectoidal monster, and then he realizes it's just a harmless form of life that means him no harm.
Right.
And he loses something like a fear of insects and a fear of spiders. So it's almost like the fear of spiders and gross bugs is a fallen world thing where, well, yeah, these could, give us diseases, or they could bite us. But it's like Ransom gets to leave behind some of the fallen world and start to look at things through the lens of an unfallen world, where now, okay, insects are kind of cool, actually. I don't have to be afraid of them the way I was anymore.
Right. That's inside the underground, essentially, right?
Yep.
So he learns to see the sort of the creepy crawlies that many people are afraid of on Earth are meant to be here too. They're a part of the creation as well, right?
Yep.
Okay, my next notes get into the Perelandra and Malacandra, their appearance when the king and the lady approach the throne up to that point. So we have this, we have this debate, and then we have this, battle manga fight, right? And eventually Ransom is victorious. So the king, which eventually they find, and the lady are able to assume their place as the king and the queen of this world, as intended by Maladil, right? And in this scene, we see Perelandra and Malacandra. They appear as a humanoid, but they don't have genitals. But they still, C.S. Lewis describes them as still expressing a concept of femininity and masculinity. I found that section rather interesting. So
is it this book he
says
talks
both
about
bodies
it
were
where
naked, and both were, and both were free from any sexual characteristics, either primary or secondary. That one would have expected. But whence came this curious difference between them? He found that he could point to no single feature wherein the difference resided, yet it was impossible to ignore. One could try, Ransom has tried 100 times, to put it into words. He has said that Malacandra was like rhythm and Perelandra like melody. He has said that Malacandra affected him like a quantitative, Perelandra like an accentual meter. He thinks that the first held in his hand something like a spear, but the hands of the other were open, with the palms toward him. But I don't know that any of these attempts has helped me much. At all events, what Ransom saw at that moment was the real meaning of gender. That's rather interesting if you're looking at that with 2021 glasses.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
So
like Lewis anticipated
what
that
do you
gender.
yeah, what do you think C.S.
I'd
Yeah,
say that.
what is C.S. Lewis trying to say here about
Okay, I'd say
gender?
this the
Yeah.
simplest, like most straightforward take is that Lewis thinks that when we see something beautiful in the male sex or see something beautiful in the female sex, there is an eternal, invisible thing that's describing. So female beauty, it sounds a little like Plato, like maybe female beauty describes
Yeah.
something like a perfect female beauty that is in contrast to a perfect male beauty. And this is completely separable from the physical sexual characteristics of men and women. And maybe he'd think, well, that's why there are languages that see maleness and femaleness in certain inanimate objects. Why do people call ships, hers? Why do we always identify ships as female? Why do we always identify certain inanimate objects as either male or female? So again,
Yeah.
like before, when Ransom saw colors that no human eye has seen and tasted tastes that no human has tasted, he's now experiencing a fullness of gender that we literally can't. The whole point is there's an example, a physical example of it on this earth. But I think Lewis is saying there's an eternal idea of masculine and femininity, both their beauty, both like all of the characteristics that we would look for in a wonderful mother or a wonderful father can be expressed in this maybe eternal, non-physical manifestation.
Yeah, Rex says it manifests through the soul somehow. This idea of the ideal feminine and the ideal masculine. Yeah, so in our current day context, I think that can be very easily confused.
Well, and I wonder if this is just
what
an
is it
example
that
of
C.S. Lewis is
Lewis.
trying to say?
Is Lewis maybe just being ahead? Like things like transvestism would have existed in Lewis's day, right? But I feel like maybe he's just getting ahead of himself and anticipating something where kind of like the modern problem is, why can't Marmaduke's fan say, oh, I think I have a female soul. I choose to be a woman. Well, because I'd be denying something true about myself. So maybe what Lewis is seeing is in its highest expression, I think there's something like masculine beauty and female beauty. And there's a difference between a hollow imitation and a love of a thing. So maybe a good illustration would be, what's the difference between like a cool tomboy and a nasty feminist, strong female protagonist archetype? And I think the big difference is like the cool tomboy is beautifully imitating things that are traditionally masculine. It's sort of like the tomboy is adding to her feminine charms certain masculine charms, but the feminist is denying both within herself. She's trying to be like a man by killing everything feminine within herself, and that doesn't make her more manly. That just kills what was beautiful about her as a woman, right? It's like Lewis is anticipating the problem of the spiritual separation of the idea of male and female from the physical, biological, scientific observation of man and woman in anatomy. But he's doing it through a Christian context rather than through a postmodern humanist context.
Right. And what he's saying is that that masculine and feminine have an ideal that is real, right? That isn't it isn't rooted in biology. Biology is just like the pale, cave wall imitation of it, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't know, but I think Lewis would say that people saying, I like to wear dresses, so therefore I'm meant to be a woman. I think he would say that was a pale imitation of the feminine as well. That there is something even more in femininity that can't be boiled down to what you like to wear, how you like to do your hair, and what you like to do for fun, right? There's something more to it that is hard to describe, right? That's
Sorry,
like
I was looking
the
at Evie's
discourse.
comments. Yeah, they're talking about what is this masculine and
Yeah,
feminine stuff? What? That's kind of like the experience of reading Perelandra. It's, what? Whoa! What? Wait a second! I've never heard anything like this. What?
You what? Yeah. I'm reading these comments too. Yeah, so Evie was saying that she thought people were transitioning in the 1930s. Rex says I would dispute transitioning. I actually don't have a deep knowledge of the history
What the
of
history is? Yeah.
transsexualism at all. But yeah,
I thought
but it wasn't
American. I thought like John Hopkins University was a pioneer of that
kind of the
later
start
in
of
the
it.
century, like more like
Yeah,
the 70s and 80s was. But the thing is though, like there could always be like an experimental phase before people start trying to normalize it at the
yeah,
institutional level. So it wouldn't be surprised me if maybe there were some experiments with it, but
yeah.
I always assumed that it became more of a cultural phenomenon in maybe around the 70s of physical surgery. I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned transvestism because
Yeah,
that's something that you can find that going back millennia, right? Like that's not too hard a thing to find.
yeah.
So yeah, basically
There have always been.
he experiences a lot. Ransom experiences a lot of things that we literally cannot put into terms because the whole point is that you cannot see this on Earth.
Right.
And the masculine and feminine thing is one of these. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so I found that interesting. Let's see, what other notes do I have here? Oh yeah, and he equates Malacandra and Perelandra to Ares and Aphrodite. Let's see. So we have this marrying of the pagan myths, right, with the Christian worldview here.
Yeah, he encounters the true Mars and the true Venus, whereas on our Earth, right, what we call Mars and Venus are really just a hollow imitation of what the true and full Mars and Venus are.
Yeah. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So there's the quote where it talks about how, but like the gods of the pagan world are basically pale shadows of what actually exists in deep heaven among the Eldiel, right? So it says here, in the mind of the fallen Archon, under whom our planet groans, the memory of deep heaven and the gods with whom he once consorted is still alive. Nay, in the very matter of our world, the traces of the celestial commonwealth are not quite lost. Memory passes through the womb and hovers in the air. The muse is a real thing. A faint breath, as Virgil says, reaches even the late generations. Our mythology is based on a solider reality than we dream, but it is also at almost infinite distance from that base. So, so we have this theory that,
Lewis
so we have this theory that yeah.
You go ahead.
So he's articulating the perspective that mythology is based on something real that exists in heaven, but the mythology is just, the cave shadow imitation of that reality, right?
Gotcha. Oh, okay. Evie did some Google.
So Evie says,
Evie did Google research.
Evie says, Googling, what was the first sex reassignment surgery in the world? And it said 1932. All right, so it does. So it did kind of exist in Lewis's time. I don't know that he would have been aware of it, though. I don't know if it would have been widely discussed.
I mean, he did pay a lot of attention to the scientific community and especially scientific experiments. So yeah. I don't know. I'd want a Lewis scholar to look into that one, actually, because it'd be really interesting to me if Lewis was aware of things like that, because you can sort of see him saying, well, okay, take that idea and push it forward. And what could be the consequence of that idea if that keeps happening, right? Like he's definitely interested in the problem of intellectuals experimenting on people in all of his work.
Yeah. Well, when we get to hideous strength, we'll be talking about that a lot. But So we have basically once again, we're expressing that perspective that mythology is real. There's something about mythology that expresses something true in reality, right?
Yep.
And we have here
means the pagans sensed something true.
Yeah. And then I have here on page 199, Ransom asking, but do I see you as you really are? And he's talking to Perelandra and Melicandra in this scene. He asks, only Maladil sees any creature as it really is, said Mars. How do you see one another? Asked Ransom. There are no holding places in your mind for an answer to that. Am I then seeing only an appearance? Is it not real at all? You see only an appearance, small one. You have never seen more than an appearance of anything, not of Arbol, nor of a stone, nor of your own body. This appearance is as true as what you see of those. So this again is expressing the perspective that what we see in the world is again only a pale shadow of what is real, right? So it's that Platonism coming in again. That there's ideal forms of things that we are only seeing reflections of, right? So we have not. So basically, saying we have never seen a real tree or a real stone or even a real human being, right? We're only seeing the we're only seeing the reflections of those things.
Yeah. It's the full statement of his theme. Like this entire time, Ransom's been experiencing things that he can't put into words, not because words are too limited. It's not that it's not that there aren't words that could describe the feeling. It's that the words aren't enough to describe the words are inadequate to describe it because he's experiencing a full truth that we use words to try to describe, but we're limited by our own capacities for language, our own limited experiences, and what we sense and feel limits our ability to understand things as they really are.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to think if there's anything else about meeting Perelandra and Melicandra.
And I also have the quote here. That is him responding to animal rationale, an animal yet also a reasonable soul. Such he remembered was the old definition of man, but he had never till now seen the reality. For now he saw this living paradise, the Lord and Lady, as the resolution of discords, the bridge that spans what would else be a chasm in creation, the keystone of the whole arch. By entering that mountain valley, they had suddenly united the war multitude of the brutes behind him with the transcorporeal intelligence at his side. They closed the circle, and with their coming, all the separate notes of strength or beauty which that assembly had hitherto struck became one music. So this is him. He's saying that the ideal, what humanity does is humanity is meant to serve as the bridge between the animal and the rational intelligences of the angels. He falls in the middle and is meant to be there in that hierarchy, connecting those two things together, right?
Right. Unity and diversity working together rather than unity and diversity in opposition to one another. So you brought up the animal point. So the animal point would be, well, these animals don't have rational minds. Well, we have rational minds, but we're made of crude matter like the animals. So are we more like the animals or are we more like the angels? And so in man, you kind of have unified these two opposing things with a purpose. And so for the male and female, you have like these two very different perspectives or kinds of beauty that together, he uses the illustration of like discordant notes in a symphony where discordant notes aren't beautiful, but in a symphony, discordant notes becomes part of something beautiful. Earlier in this whole debate with Weston, a lot of it came down to, well, is God just the same thing as Satan, or are these two different things? You know, is it possible for us to know what there is in the universe? So Weston got mired in trying to fix humanity's problem and sunk down into the darkness. But when Ransom escapes that and goes to meet Kandra and Perelandra, he sees this sort of beautiful contrast between two things that are different from one another, but sharing with one another in a higher purpose. So he doesn't confuse Milkandra and Perelandra. They are different from one another, yet kind of like under Maleldil, they share a purpose, and they share existence in part of like a greater beautiful thing. So there's a sense in which there's a oneness, and there's a sense where there's an individuality. Yeah.
Right. Sorry, I was just answering the question in the chat. Where do we get these books? Yeah, so they're on Amazon. I am reading quotes right out of my my Kindle book here. So so they are, all three of the books in this trilogy are on Kindle. And Marm, you were listening to them as audiobooks, so they also exist on audio?
Yep, Audible. I'm sure some pirate has put them on some site for you, but that would be unethical. Yeah, you can get them on Audible. You can get them at the library. They're not hard to come by. Yeah. And the irony of this book, okay, if you Google C.S. Lewis Space Trilogy, you'll find them. The irony, of course, is that C.S. Lewis didn't like calling it space. So that's the sad joke, is he wrote these books to get people to stop calling it space, and everybody calls the books the Space Trilogy. But that's what you got to do.
Yeah, so that's hilarious. And I was thinking when I was titling the stream, like, should I keep saying Space Trilogy? But then I was like, but I want everyone to know. Yeah. But then I was like, I want everyone to know this is the second episode of a series. So
we could just be hipsters. We could be total hipsters and call it the Space Trilogy, air quotes.
Air quotes, yeah. No, Evie says there some pirate has put them on YouTube. Okay.
Of course they have. Everything's on YouTube.
Yeah. Okay, so I have also here on page 215. So this is still in the scene in which the Lord and the Lady are taking their place, right? Their proper place in this world. So this is in response to, there's this long speech from the El Deal about where God is. Let's see. So it was, so Ransom asks, I am full of doubts and ignorance, said Ransom. In our world, those who know Maladil believe that his coming down to us and being a man is the central happening of all that happens. If you take that from me, Father, whither will you lead me? Surely not to the enemy's talk, which thrusts my world and my race into a remote corner and gives me a universe with no center at all, but millions of worlds that lead nowhere, or what is worse, to more and more worlds forever, and comes over me with numbers and empty spaces and repetitions and asks me to bow down before bigness. Or do you make your world the center? But I am troubled. What of the people of Malacandra? Would they also think that their world was the center? I do not even see how your world can rightly be called yours. You were made yesterday, and it is from old. The most of it is water, where you cannot live. And what of the things beneath its crust? And of the great spaces with no world at all? Is the enemy easily answered when he says that all is without plan or meaning? As soon as we think we see one, it melts away into nothing, or into some other plan that we never dreamed of. And what was the center becomes the rim, till we doubt if any shape or plan or pattern was ever more than a trick of our own eyes, cheated with hope or tired with too much looking. To what is all driving? What is the morning you speak of? What is it the beginning of? And so we have in these pages, we have this long speech explaining what the center is, right? And the highlighted quote that I have here says, where Maladil is, there is the center. He is in every place, not some of him in one place and some in another, but in each place the whole Maladil, even in the smallness beyond thought. There is no way out of the center, save into the bent will, which casts itself into the nowhere. Blessed be he. Each thing was made for him. He is the center. Because we are with him, each of us is at the center. It is not as in a city of the darkened world, where they say that each must live for all. In his city, all things are made for each. When he died in the wounded world, he died not for me, but for each man. If each man had been the only man made, he would have done no less. Each thing, from the single grain of dust to the strongest eldeal, is the end and the final cause of all creation, and the mirror in which the beam of his brightness comes to rest, and so returns to him. Blessed be he. So Ransom is confused because, well, I thought Christ's death and resurrection, that's supposed to be the center of everything. But now we're saying that Venus is the center, right?
Right.
And what they're saying is that, but what's being said here is that you don't divide God that way. Like God is fully present everywhere, right? So
right.
everything in his creation is the center, right? And saying that Christ's coming is the center does not diminish the fact that whatever happens on Malacandra is the center, or whatever happens on Perelandra is the center. It's all the center, right?
I also think this gets at Lewis trying to talk about the medieval view in the modern context in an interesting way, where he doesn't reject modern science, but he does reject the idea that modern science can dictate to us what beauty should be or what purpose should be. So one interesting thing about that description you just quoted is, if you ask an astronomer, and the astronomer says, well, the galaxy the universe is always expanding, right? Every galaxy is getting farther away from every other galaxy. And one of the things they argue is that if you look at any point, it'll look like that's the center of the universe because everything is expanding away from it, right? So Lewis isn't saying that. He's saying God is the center of the universe, which means at any planet you look at, if God is active there, in that sense, that planet is the center of the universe. Getting back into kind of like the medieval Galileo fight, the question is, people misrepresent the Galileo story. So kind of like the fedora hat way of representing the Galileo story is that Galileo discovered that the earth revolves around the sun, and then the mean, no good, horrible, bad Catholic Church punished Galileo for saying the earth revolves around the sun, right? That's the bad way of trying to describe the story. The reality is much more complicated than that. But one thing about it is, people didn't say, well, the earth is the center of the universe because we're so special and God made us special. Their argument was the earth is the center of the universe in the sense that we're the lowest. I think some people would even say it's almost like we're the butt of the universe, and everything else above the earth is greater than us, and we're right. We're the ass end of the universe. So something Lewis is saying, he's getting back to this problem of what's the center of the universe. In a pre-scientific age, they would definitely say, well, the earth is the center of the universe. So, scientists observe the earth revolving around the sun. And then the fedora tippers say, you see, that proves the church is wrong. And I think Lewis is trying to come around and say, no, that hasn't proved what the medievalists were saying wrong, because they're not describing the same kind of thing. Galileo is looking through a telescope and he's seeing shadows on Venus, and that's able to prove to him that, well, there you go, that Venus must be revolving around the sun, right? That has nothing to do with what your mental picture of the universe is. So what Lewis hates is this idea of a cold, dead, bleak, threatening, empty, lifeless universe that we're supposed to be afraid of. And I think he's saying that if you take the scientific view that the universe is expanding, and any point of the universe could be said to be the central point of the universe, you could portray that in like a dark, bleak, cold, heartless way, or you could look at that through the lens of a Christian worldview, where that means that God has value and purpose in every part of the universe. It's sort of like he's trying to say the division between religion and science isn't a division because they're describing two different things. And once you understand that, you resolve the apparent division or contradiction.
Right. And let's see, what else do I have here?
Yes, by the way, I think we agree that the Earth does revolve around the sun, just in case anyone's wondering.
Yeah. So EVS. So it was a misunderstanding of the meaning of center between Galileo and the church at the time. Well, it goes into. Okay, here's what I was taught as a Catholic. That the Catholic Church objected to what Galileo said because Galileo went beyond his remit, essentially, and said things that his science did not actually prove. Like, and that, in fact, the evidence for the Earth revolving around the sun was first of all not 100% complete at that time, right? So there were questions that were left unanswered, because the math was not there.
For example, if you tried to use Galileo's method to predict the movement of the constellations, his model wasn't as good at predicting the movements as the constellations as the old models were, because the old scientific models also had years of observation behind them. The problem with the old scientific models is they couldn't explain things that Galileo could observe through his telescope. So there is an element of, what I was trying to say is, there is an element of truth to the church persecuting Galileo, but because fedoras don't understand the history, they miscommunicate what was going on. Part of what I was trying to say is there was also like a scientific community that was opposed to Galileo, and Galileo perceived himself as being part of the church. So while it is true that there were people who were opposed to Galileo for purely religious reasons, that doesn't mean that Galileo was an atheist, and it doesn't mean that the people opposing Galileo were, doctrinaire and anti-science people. It was a scientific dispute that that touched upon a religious dispute. And Lewis, I think the point I'm trying to get at is Lewis's solution to the problem is to say that there's a difference between scientifically observing nature and observing reality to find the truth, and trying to describe reality using a word picture. And he's angry at the idea that you could use sort of a cold, lifeless word picture. That's the main thing I'm trying to get at. Lewis doesn't hate science. He hates people who say, # the science says we're nothing but bags of meat with electrical chemical processes creating our thoughts. Yeah.
Right. That the issue is taking science beyond what it is actually capable of explaining. Right. I've said on previous streams that in my tradition there's a division between like the mechanistic and the teleological explanations for things. So, science does a very good job of, at least in, my tradition says that science does a very good job in explaining the how of things, the mechanism, right? But it can't tell us why, and it also can't tell us what we should do with that information. Science is a great tool that should exist in this matrix of knowledge that involves things that are not mechanistic at all, right? And I think that's what Lewis wants to get across too, is not that science is bad, but that if you hold science up as an idol, right, that's where you start going wrong. When you say that science is the center and is the center of everything and explains everything and gives us a guidance for everything, right? That's where you're going wrong.
Yep. Again, this is more stuff. These are kind of like the prototypes of ideas that will be more explicitly discussed in that hideous strength. I'm trying to think. I had a nice little article on the Galileo myth somewhere, but I had it years ago. But basically, what I say is I'm going off of just like secondhand information. But my advice is, anytime you want to go read the primary sources and never rely on some bloggers take on it if you want to get the full story.
Especially some Fedora tipper. And it's been and likewise, it's been a while since I was taught in my tradition about what happened there with Galileo. But it went into again, he couldn't explain. he didn't have the tools to explain his theory, so he couldn't explain how it worked, right? Because not all of the evidence was there, not all of the tools of explanation was there, people had reason to doubt that it was true. It's not like, and then the other thing is, Galileo was saying some, what I understand, he was saying some rude things that had nothing to do with the science that also offended the church as well. So, but yeah, it's been a while. I'll have to go back and look at all my old sources about that too. But the bottom line is that the Galileo thing is a lot more complex and nuanced than a fedora tipper would make it out to be. Ellipses, yeah. Yeah, I think I think one of the issues with Galileo is the math wasn't there yet. the mathematics hadn't developed to a point that we could explain what was going on with the motions of the constellations and the heavenly bodies, right? Using
we need advanced telescopes to observe some things in space closely enough to start doing it. Yeah, like one of the famous examples is parallax. The Greeks would argue, well, wait a second, if the stars are far away from each other, then we should see parallax as we're moving around them, right? And we don't see any parallax. Therefore, the stars must be fixed points in space, right? So based on their information, that's actually a logical conclusion. It's just when you get more information, then you can say, oh, the stars do have parallax. We just couldn't see them closely enough to observe how far away they were.
Yeah, Rex says, I have heard that very, very few of the scientists who oppose the sciences of the church were non-religious. Yes, that is true. So Galileo considered himself a member of the church. Kepler, who worked out some of the laws of orbital mechanics, was part of the church, considered himself part of the church as well. Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, was a monk. So the whole idea that there is some division between the church and science, it's really a false idea. The members of the church were members of the scientific community. So,
and not only that, but for many of them, there was a motivating factor where I love God. I want to find out more about God's beautiful world. So the scientific method becomes a way of finding out more about the world. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So to pull back to Lewis here, now that we've veered off on that tangent on church history. So one of Lewis's points, which will become much more apparent when we get to Hideous Strength, is that science, the science, capital T, capital S, unmoored from any kind of moral matrix, is in fact a very horrible and demonic thing. But that doesn't mean that science in its place among the other routes to knowledge, that doesn't mean that science in its place is bad, right? Okay, so let's see, what else have I got? Oh, this is more of, it's all the center. Yeah. So that goes back to what we were saying before, that God is the center, and since God is everywhere, that makes everywhere the center, right? Let's see. Love me, my brothers, for I am infinitely superfluous, and your love shall be like his, born neither of your need nor of my deserving, but a plain bounty. Blessed be he. There seems no plan because it is all plan. There seems no center because it is all center. Blessed be he. So again, this is the response. This is Lewis responding in narrative to what moderns are saying about the universe being purposeless and meaningless, right? And it seems that way because of how large and vast it is, right? But the response is that purposeless is because the purpose is everywhere, right? It's not in this one little place, right? Yeah. And that's where my notes stop.
Okay.
What else do you have? What else would you like to discuss?
Maybe one thing I want to highlight. So we got on this tangent because Lewis is trying to describe basically what is the center of the universe, right? Is the problem he's set for himself. And it's clear to me that Lewis is aware of modern astronomy for what him would have been cutting edge science on astronomy. And he's trying to describe the Christian view and line it up and say the Christian view is consistent with the modern scientific view. At the same time, he's also afraid of this scientific thing in the background. So earlier, I think this will tie in. Yeah. Earlier when he had his conversation with Weston mentioned that part of his sort of becoming a religious atheist was realizing that in physics, there were things he couldn't explain logically. Maybe there are aspects of, the atom or the behavior of subatomic particles that don't operate under the sort of straightforward logical laws that we generally think of. Like when we think of physics, we generally think of, Newtonian physics, which is, you can explain Newtonian physics to a child and they'll get it. But maybe once you start getting into quantum physics and weird stuff like that, or Schrodinger's cat, it's like sort of like, what even are you trying to say? The cat is alive and isn't alive at the same time. So part of the point is, depending on who you're talking to, right? Like, I think there's a way that you could, maybe part of the problem is the way scientists choose to word themselves. Like if scientists say you can be something and nothing, that's a horrible way of wording yourself. Maybe there's a better way they could word it to make the point correctly. But if you were to take them seriously, that you can be something and nothing, then the result would be like philosophical chaos, right? So for Weston, philosophical chaos was part of his problem, where he started with that and then ends up in darkness. Lewis is trying to describe the problem of, well, what if we really can't explain the way the universe works with science and with logic? Maybe the wholesome conclusion is we don't have to conclude from that therefore we have no purpose or we have no logic or laws that we must follow.
Right.
Now you have more of a scientific background for me. So like Schrodinger's cat is always the thing I think of as people who #love the science. They'll wear Schrodinger's cat t-shirts. So like, how would you put it, right? Because I feel like what some people think Schrodinger's cat means is that the cat can be alive and dead at the same time until we look at it, right? And to me, that just sounds like philosophical, not right. So how would you put that?
Well, my background's not in physics, so I'm not as good at explaining that as I am in explaining like biology and the brain. But what I do understand as far as from the physics perspective is I do know, for example, that at the subatomic level, when you observe things, it fundamentally changes the thing. I do know that. Like there's the act of observation changes something, which may be what Schrodinger's cat is getting at. Yeah. When you're not observing it, it could basically be anything. But as soon as you open up the box and you observe it, it is this one thing, right?
Right.
I also know that, like with electrons, there's only like one parameter you can calculate at a time. Like you can know where it is, but not how fast it's going. Something like that. Like you know where it is, but not how fast it's going, or you can know how fast it's going, but not where it is. Like things like that, where like I said, there's only one parameter at a time that you can observe. And yeah, it gets a little weird, but it's been 20 years since I've been in a physics class. So since I've been in a modern physics class, so it's a little, I would have to like look into it a little further to really explain to you what's going on there.
Gotcha.
But
so
I did have to take a year of physics for my major.
But at the general level, not necessarily at the specialist level.
Yeah,
The
not
reason I
special
bring it
level.
up, the reason I bring it up is I think Lewis is grappling with like a problem of what if we can't use logic to explain the universe, and he sees the problem where if atheists conclude we can't use logic to explain the universe, then we're basically screwed, right? Like we're stuck at the point where we can't even like talk about normal everyday, you know, the scientific observations and understand each other. And I think he's looking at Christianity as a way of trying to explain the universe when we're trying to describe things where logic literally can't describe it because we're operating in a field where our experience is too limited to describe what we're seeing, right? So if we try to apply our logic to these mystical things, where it's a mistake, right? Like Ransom can't logically piece together what Malacandra and Perelandra are because they're above him. He doesn't have a category. Oh, a beautiful thing is that he had to explain to the woman things that she couldn't understand because she didn't have a frame of reference for. And then at the end of his story, he gets to encounter something that he doesn't really have a frame of reference to describe. All he has to do is sort of, he has to accept it as a blessing or torture himself with it. And he's learned to accept it as a blessing rather than torture himself with it.
Yeah. I think that there is a reason that my last physics class was in 1997, but I think there is a reason why if you look at the authors out there, the Christian apologist authors out there that focused especially on science and its interaction with religion, there's a reason why a lot of them come from the world of physics, because studying physics seems to have convinced a lot of people that this universe is a lot more mysterious, than we originally thought it was. And physics has brought a lot of people to the faith once they've actually dived deep down into the quantum physics and what goes on at the subatomic level and so on. So it suddenly gets very, very weird.
And it doesn't always manifest as it doesn't always manifest as like orthodox Christianity, but like even Einstein was no friend of the Christian concept of God, but towards the end of his life, he would write letters saying that, the deeper I get into this, the more I believe there has to be something like a God, right? Like if the early atheists thought we're going to solve all the problems of the universe and then we're going to eliminate the need for God because, we understand that lightning is electrons. We don't need a God to explain lightning. We've run into this problem where it's like we've hit a wall that we can't use our powers to explain beyond this wall. So it's like that's where we're stuck. You can't. They couldn't disprove the existence of God using the scientific method. So
right. So but there are in fact physicists out there that are fully Christian, and they cite as their reason for being Christian the fact that they study physics and said, boy, this universe is really strange. Like, and I'm sure every Christian here has heard discussions of the fine-tuning hypothesis and stuff like that. Those are all coming from physicists. So so it seems like people who study biology and neuroscience, what I studied in undergrad, they're more prone to get too big for the britches than the physicists, because the physicists are really looking at some pretty strange things and realizing that there is more to this world than what can be explained by your philosophy.
Right.
Yeah.
Was there anything about after he encounters Perelandra and Malacandra? Because remember, right, the early chapters is what happens after he goes back and meets Lewis and the others again. So I recall Perelandra essentially just ending with his last conversation with them before they send him back.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we kind of cover.
I don't have any more notes.
All right, and I kind of got to touch one of the things I wanted to touch on.
And I think ending on
Lewis is very good at having
ahead.
his theme consistent, like from beginning to middle to end, and even like across all three books. He's developed themes that he introduced quickly in Out of the Silent Planet, and he's introduced themes briefly in Perelandra that he'll focus on much more thoroughly in that Hideous Strength. So I think I read somewhere that Lewis's plans for that Hideous Strength changed radically because he made a friend who was a King Arthur nerd, and so he decided to like bring in a lot of King Arthur stuff into that Hideous Strength. It's definitely one of the weirdest and most unique series of 3 books where there is a consistent theme throughout the 3 books, but each is its own thing. Out of the Silent Planet, it's a bit more of an adventure story in the classic sci-fi genre with Lewis's twist on it. Perelandra is him developing further his really specific, really weird C.S. Lewis ideas across an entire book that's mostly focused on a single extended debate between 2 characters. So if you liked Out of the Silent Planet, you will love Perelandra. And if what you liked about Out of the Silent Planet was that it was weird, Perelandra is weird in its own uniquely weird way.
And then you get to that Hideous Strength, which I was saying in the pre-show that I've already finished my reread of that, and I have a zillion notes on that one because when we get to that one, there's going to be a lot of marriage between what's going on there and what's happening in our world today, and stuff like, again, the more stuff on the C.S. Lewis's cosmology, medieval cosmology, and the descent of the planets and stuff like that. You know, there's a lot to discuss. That's the book that's going to take the most effort to unpack because there's so much. That one is the thickest and fullest book of the 3. So
it's the weirdest good book I've ever read.
The weirdest good book, yeah, for sure. So that is going to be our next stream in this series. My next stream might be Iron Man. Iron Man might intervene first, but eventually we are going to get to that Hideous Strength, and that's going to be I anticipate that's going to be a very long discussion because there's so much discussed in that book. So I hope I see those of you who showed up for the live showing today. I hope to see you all there. Marm, any final thoughts before we sign off for the night?
Thank you for having me on. Everybody like, comment, and subscribe to the Right Geeks channel. If you've read these books, share your thoughts in the description below to tell the YouTube algorithm to encourage it to. I lost my train of. I didn't lose my train of thought. I lost my sentence of thought. All right. To encourage more people to check out this great channel. Thank you, The Right Geek, for having me on and for discussing this great book series with me.
And thank you to those of you who came for the live show, and to those of you who are going to be watching this asynchronously later. Thank you for listening. And this is The Right Geek signing out.
Catch you later.